Hi, welcome to Constitutional Chats, hosted by me, Janine Turner,
and Kathy Gillespie,
with students
Dakari Chapman
and me, Tova Kaplan.
Join us as we discuss hot topic issues with constitutional experts. It's sponsored by Constituting America.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats. We are so excited that you are here with us today, and we are very excited with our special guest, Tony Williams. Today is episode 2 in our series on the Anti-Federalist Papers, where every week, as we count down to Constitution Day, we are comparing an Anti-Federalist paper with a Federalist paper on a different topic. And today's topic is partly national, partly federal, and we're going to be looking at Federal Farmer 1 and Federalist 39. We want to first thank our sponsor for today, Barbara Bowie Whitman. Dr. Barbara Bowie Whitman is an economist and a retired Foreign Service officer. She was educated at the College of William and Mary and Southern Methodist University and earned her doctorate in economics from the George Washington University. She's a former Fulbright scholar and served in embassies around the world. And her last position was trade policy coordinator for the Western Hemisphere in the U.S. Department of State, where she served as the senior State Department negotiator on free trade agreements with 9 countries. It's really interesting that Barbara's first foray into politics was over 6 decades ago, beginning as an 11-year-old when she wrote a campaign song for Dwight Eisenhower. Barbara is a great leader, and we are happy to announce that she is the newest member of Constituting America's Leadership Board. So Barbara, thank you so much for your sponsorship today. We are very grateful. Now we want to introduce some of our panelists before we get to our introduction of our special guest. And I am going to start with our media director, Aubrey Jackson, who makes it all happen. Aubrey is responsible for all of this fabulous technology. And speaking of the technology, Aubrey, I'm going to ask if you'll put a poll up so that we can see who is in our audience today. While I'm introducing Aubrey, if you wouldn't mind checking if you are an elementary school, middle school, or high school, college student, a teacher, parent, grandparent with children, donor, press, family, friend, tell us a little, check one of those boxes, fan, that tells us about you, and that helps us know who's in the audience. So Aubrey, it's, while everyone is checking those boxes, I will tell you that Aubrey is this year's We the Future Best College STEM winner. She was born and raised in Utah in the middle of 7 children. She's a student at Brigham Young University and aspires to be an athletic coach. So Aubrey, have we given people enough time to fill out the form?
Yeah, I think so.
Would you like to say hi and tell us who we have today?
Yeah, for sure. We have a great group with us today. So we have 25% fans, 21% friends, and then another 21% parent or grandparents with children. And then we're so excited to have 8% family, 4% press, another 8% of donors, and another 4% of middle and high school students.
That's great. Thank you very much. Now, on our panel today, we have got Jewel and Jorn Gilbert. Jewel Gilbert is executive producer and Jorn is operations director of Sing for America, a family-based company that the brothers co-founded. Sing for America seeks to show the art of truth and light through live performance. Both are proud former We the Future contest winners. Sing for America is an actor-run theater company which specializes in semi-professional musicals, private training in the arts, school drama solutions, and public entertainment events, all the while revealing a colorblind world on stage. Jewel and Jorn are graduates of Moravian College, where they each earned a BA in musical performance and dramatic production. Now, before I introduce Tony, I do want to say that we are missing two very important people today on our constitutional chats. One is our founder and co-president, actress Janine Turner. And we're excited because Janine is on a movie set, filming a movie today. And when she is back with us, probably next week, maybe she can tell us a little bit more about what she's filming and where you're going to be able to see it and when. But we're definitely going to miss having Janine with us today. And then Tova Kaplan, our National Youth Director, is missing as well. But in true Tova fashion, Tova sent questions for us to ask. So Aubrey will be asking some of Tova's questions a little bit later. So now it is my pleasure to introduce our special guest, Tony Williams. Tony is a senior fellow at the Bill of Rights Institute in Arlington, Virginia. And we do encourage y'all to check out the Bill of Rights Institute and look at some of their programs, especially if you're a teacher. They've got wonderful programs. They also have great programs for students as well. Tony is the author of 6 books, including Washington and Hamilton, The Alliance That Forged America, and Hamilton, An American Biography. He's presently writing a book on the Declaration of Independence. He lives with his wife and children in Williamsburg, Virginia, and he is coming to us today from historic Williamsburg in his beautiful library. Tony is a frequent essayist in our 90-day study series, 90 and 90 equals 180, History Holds the Key to the Future, having written over 83 essays for our studies over the last 11 years. And Tony is a frequent guest on our constitutional chats. So Tony Williams, welcome to our chat today on Partly National, Partly Federal, Federal Farmer 1 and Federalist 39.
Kathy, it's a pleasure as always to be here. Thanks to you and Janine for inviting me, to all our panelists and all our people who are watching, and especially to your donor.
Well, we appreciate it. And we would love, maybe you could just start with a few opening comments and tell us a little bit about both Federal Farmer 1 and the Federalist 39 and the Anti-Federalist papers in general.
Sure, I'll be happy to cue that up for our discussion. You know, I think that you're running a really great series here, and I know some of your guests. I'm good friends with some of the other scholars, and it's really as remarkable as a lot of the other series you've run on your chats and also on your essay series. So keep doing great work. As far as these 2 papers, I think that it's important to note that they're part of this really vibrant and vigorous debate and deliberation over the Constitution in 1787 and 1788. I like to call it, the great deliberative moment of the American Revolution and founding. Really, it's a moment unlike any other in world history, right? Where not only these great statesmen and politicians, but also ordinary citizens were debating the ideas about human nature and the principles of government and the best forms of government, what would be most suitable to the American people. And they did so in ratifying conventions and state legislatures. They did it in great essays and pamphlets that were written on each side. But they're also doing it in taverns and street corners and in people's homes. I mean, the people take part of this discussion too, and that's why I think it's so remarkable. And as I said, it's just this great founding deliberative moment, unlike anything that's ever been seen before. And so who's doing this debating? Well, as you probably know from watching previous episodes, it's being done by the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, right? The Federalists are those who support this new Constitution that was created during the hot summer in Philadelphia in 1787 and was then sent to Congress in these ratifying conventions. And the Anti-Federalists are those who are either opposed to the Constitution or at least have objections to it and would like some changes or revisions. And so those are the 2 sides that are contending in this debate. And I think it's very important to note something. They agree on an awful lot, right? They agreed on really kind of the view of human nature as flawed but capable of virtue. They agree upon ultimately a limited government. They agree on, republicanism, a Republican form of government, and also protecting the people's liberties. And so they're in favor of free government. And they also agree that there should be some kind of federal system, right? That we should have the states with some powers and the national government with some powers. Where they really disagree is evident in our papers today, right? They disagree over the respective amount of powers that each level of government should have, the states versus the federal government. And so that's why I love these two papers, because it really draws out the essential debate and differences between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And one more final point. This whole debate that they're having is so relevant to today, right? I mean, they're talking about human nature. They're talking about the best form of government to achieve liberty. They're talking about, should the states or national government have more powers, right? How much money should we spend, right? They're talking about aristocracies and elites, but also the common people. It's just this whole proper balance of government is something we've debated throughout history, right? Jefferson and Hamilton were doing it in the early republic, and Clay and Calhoun and Webster, and then Lincoln. We fought a civil war over some of these questions. And that debate endured throughout the 20th century as the federal government became much larger and started spending more and more money. And we're debating it today, right? With the infrastructure bill and regulations about COVID and all the stimulus money and so forth. So these questions are still around today of very enduring relevance, and they're not going to go away in the future either. So it may seem at times to be somewhat of an obscure debate from 1787, but it's really not. It's really important questions that last right through today. So as far as the papers go, let me just say a few words, and then I'll take some questions, and we'll dig around in there a lot more. Federalist 39, James Madison writes it as part of the Federalist, which was published in newspapers, primarily New York, and then later assembled into a book form. And in it, he's talking about what is the character of the new government. And he says there are parts of it which support a stronger national government, a more vigorous and vibrant, stronger national government. And there are parts of it that preserve that federal character, which sort of preserve power to the states. And he provides several examples, which we'll get to. But in the end, he calls it partly federal and partly national. It's an interesting conglomeration of both, and the world had never really seen that. So we'll talk about how innovative that is. The federal farmer, whose identity we still are not exactly sure about, a lot of scholars fall back on Virginia's own Richard Henry Lee. And he expresses several times, if you read these papers, and I really encourage every citizen and student who's watching today to do so, he really warns that this government is not really federal. It's promoting what he calls a great consolidation. That you're going to have a very strong national government. It's going to become sort of tyrannical. It's going to violate liberties. It's going to promote this sort of aristocracy of the powerful and interested. But again, warns of that consolidated national government, which of course the Federalists were trying to do in this new Constitution. They were trying to empower the national government to do more than had existed under the Articles of Confederation. So again, to sum this up, and then we'll get to everybody, the experience of the Revolution really shapes how they're viewing things. The Federalists were concerned about how things were going under the Articles of Confederation, want to strengthen that national government, but preserve federalism. The Anti-Federalists really coming out of the principles of the Declaration 1776. Think the Articles of Confederation were working really just fine, maybe giving the national government a few more powers, but by and large wanted to preserve most of the power in the states closest to the people where their liberties can be preserved. So I look forward to all your questions, but that's a general summary of things.
Well, thank you very much. And, before we started this series, I don't think I had ever read an anti-federalist paper, I have to admit. And I was even a political science major. So it's been really valuable to me. And like you, I encourage everyone to read the papers. But I found when I was looking, we have the Federal Farmer one up on our website. And we actually had it up in as early as 2013 when we did a study with Hillsdale, where with their permission, we reprinted some of their original documents. And then we had essays on some of what we called the classics that inspired the Constitution. And I noticed a note from Hillsdale when they reprinted Federal Farmer One, that they said that this particular anti-federalist paper was called the most plausible. I think it said, let's see, Alexander Hamilton acknowledged the Federal Farmer as the most plausible anti-federalist. Could you talk a little bit about that? Why Hamilton might have said that this particular anti-federalist paper was the most plausible?
Sure. And I also might want to plug Gordon Lloyd's The Essential Anti-Federalist, which is a great resource and he was on a previous episode and a
Yes.
common friend of ours, a great guy and a great scholar. But, I think what Hamilton is alluding to there is that, Richard Henry Lee's paper, the essay, is just extremely, it's not only very accessible and just very readable, but he's really laying out a few basic points, and he's doing so very reasonably. And he not only warns, as I said earlier, against this consolidation of power in the national government and preserving power to the states, but he says, look, when we in Congress authorized these delegates to Philadelphia in 1787, they agreed to revise the articles, right? And what he says is, sure, we should do that now. There are a few problems, right? We should empower the national government to regulate trade between the states and with foreign nations. Yes, we do want a vibrant national defense, and maybe the national government needs to pass a few more taxes, not too many, but a few more taxes to be able to execute its powers. And he concedes that, right? And I think that that's really the ultimate strength of what Hamilton's talking about is because when he does that, he sort of undermines this much more powerful government that was created on the Constitution, which of course Hamilton has many reasons for supporting himself, and he does so in the Federalist. But it concedes the few points about the problems of the articles without going there, right? Without that consolidation, without becoming too powerful because you're threatening liberty. And so I think that's really what they're alluding to there.
And that quote even goes back to your point about there were many things that they did agree on. The other thing I was hoping that you could do before we get too far into this discussion, since the title of our episode is partly federal, partly national, can you define for us what the federal system of government versus the national system of government is, especially for some of our students who might be watching, so they really understand when we say partly federal, partly national, what does that mean?
Right. Well, the national government is probably a simpler concept, so we'll start there. It's simply saying there's a national government and it has national powers, right? And we can understand what those national powers are, right? I mentioned a few. Powers over war and treaties, relationships with other nations, regulating trade with other nations, settling disputes among the states. There are a few, very legitimate powers that any national government would have, right? And those are sort of, to execute national objects, okay? The federal system is sort of an American invention in many ways, and it's more complicated, right? But it's not that hard to understand. It basically means that there's a national government over the entire union, the entire country, but there's still states, right? And today, there are 50. Back then, there were 13. And that there's a dynamic there, right? That the federal government, or I should say national government, still has those national powers, and the states really have all other powers, right? They're sort of repositories of most of the powers because they're closest to the people. Sometimes, though, there are shared powers, right? And that's where things kind of get hazy and confusing. Which level of government should be in control of trade? Is trade going on within a state? Is it going across state borders? When exactly does that occur? And so, if you're looking at something like, uh, a truck going across interstate borders or staying within a state, exactly where is that trade going on? We could see that that can become very complex right away, and that there could be disputes over those what are called concurrent powers, or basically just shared powers over things like trade and et cetera. So the big trick of the Constitutional Convention and the Federalists in terms of this debate over the ratification of the Constitution is how to persuade Americans at the time that you can have a national government and state governments at the same time, because most of the time in world history, either had just a strong central government or an empire or what have you, or, a monarch or a dictator, despot, or you had local governments, right? Like we think of the city states in ancient Greece, for example, right? They were very independent. They governed themselves. They ruled themselves. There wasn't much binding Greece together in terms of a national government. So how do you combine those? It was in a fancy Latin term. It was called an imperium and imperio, right? How do you have these sort of different sovereignties or different authorities at different levels? It wasn't easy, right? And I'm not sure that the framers, when they went into the Constitutional Convention, really had it in mind. It's really something that sort of develops during the convention, and that even we're in the ratification debate, and we're sort of still wrestling with some of those tensions today, of course.
Definitely. Well, thank you for that. So let's turn to Jewel and Jorn and get some of your questions.
Hi, Tony. How are you?
Doing well.
So can you tell us again, what was the idea of the national government then? What would that have looked like? Because it's hard to understand. We know that they wanted states still. So then what was the Anti-Federalist Vision? And I know it was more similar to Articles of Confederation, but it's still hard to wrap my head around about where the direction then would have ended.
Right. Good. Great question. So William Patterson at the convention from New Jersey, submits to the New Jersey plan and basically says, we'll keep the powers under the articles because the national government achieves national objects and it still needs to have some powers. But we concede that the national government needs a few more powers, like regulating trade and taxation and so forth. So they were going to empower it, much like Richard Henry Lee is alluding to in Federal Farmer. As envisioned by Madison, Madison really was worried at the convention and in the debate that the Articles was a failure, and this was most notably seen in a lot of the tyrannical laws that were happening in the states. So he really wanted to strengthen the national government and strengthen the national government's ability to act even on individual citizens, right? And so to have much greater powers. And those powers we can see in the Constitution as it was ratified, right? We can look to Congress in Article 1, Section 8. A pretty long list of enumerated powers, right? And those include, the ability to raise an army and navy, and establish post offices, and build roads, and pass taxes and tariffs, regulate trade between the states and with foreign nations, et cetera. And the national executive, the president, also has those national powers in Article 2. And then you'd have that national judiciary with somewhat vaguely defined powers in Article 3, but still, the court's jurisdiction is pretty well established. And so that would be the kind of national government, much more empowered than had existed under the Articles. But it's important to concede to the Federalists that it's still a limited government, right? It still has enumerated powers. this is not an unlimited government that can do anything it wants, right? That would be tyranny. That would threaten the people's liberties. But it was much more powerful than had existed under the Articles.
Do you want to ask yours?
Oh, yeah. So just to so I can place some names and so everyone can, who were the main players in the Anti-Federalists on the Anti-Federalist side, and who are our main because we pushers on the Federalist side. So we know a lot more of who was behind the Federalists, but just to restate it so that we can really line up the two sides and see.
Right. Well, I'll throw a few names out there and not be exhaustive by any means. But, your main Federalists are people like, obviously, Hamilton and Madison, John Jay of New York, who they wrote the Federalist Papers. George Washington is a big supporter. John Marshall is at the Virginia Ratifying Convention. And there are others who are anti-federalists, right? Most notably, Patrick Henry and James Madison have this sort of titanic debate in the Virginia Ratifying Convention, where they're debating these great things like Titans. People like Richard Henry Lee, who are writing the Anti-Federalist Papers. There's the Clinton faction, Governor Clinton in New York, and a lot of his allies and so forth. So in these key states like Virginia, Massachusetts, New York, there are a number of very important anti-federalists, but also federalists as well. And this great debate shapes up, especially in those key states. I think it's also important to note some people who weren't at the convention, the Constitutional Convention or in the ratifying conventions. People like John Adams, right, or Thomas Jefferson, right? They're away in Europe as diplomats and are not at the convention. So it's important to know who's there, who's not there, what sides they're on, and how and why the Constitution is shaped up as it is, and then sent to the people. And by the way, the Federalists, after the Constitution was ratified, the Federalists wanted to send it to the people, to popular ratifying conventions within the state. So it's a federal measure because it's sent to the states for ratification, but to the conventions themselves, where they thought it would receive a more favorable reception, and also because they wanted the people to be responsible for ratifying the fundamental law of the land, which was the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists really wanted it, and he says, Richard Henry Lee says this, Federal Farmer says this in his paper. The Anti-Federalists wanted it sent to Congress and then the state legislatures. And it's pretty smart, because he knew that there would be a lot more opposition in the existing state legislatures. So even that simple device and how the Constitution is ratified is really part of this larger debate, and really part of the strategy on both sides, because it was deeply rooted in these political strategies of each side.
So
Well, and
each
I
side.
wanted-
Sorry,
Oh.
Kathy, go ahead.
Well, that's, I just want to jump in just for a second, Tony, because you just answered a question that has been burning in my mind. And I felt like it was almost too basic to even ask. But I wondered if the Federalists are more for a strong national government and the Anti-Federalists are really for a federal system of government, then why were the Federalists called Federalists and maybe not like nationalists? Or why were the Anti-Federalists called Anti-Federalists when they were really for a federal system of government, which more state powers? But I think you just answered it in that the Federalists wanted the Constitution to be ratified through a federal system, meaning the states having the power to ratify the Constitution. And the Anti-Federalists wanted the Congress, they wanted the national government to ratify it. Is that what you're saying? Because they thought Congress wouldn't ratify it?
Well, the state legislatures too. Well, I would only tweak that a little bit to just to say that, both want some degree of a federal system, right? With the Federalists wanting, sort of the more lion's share of power with the national government, and the Anti-Federalists wanting the larger share in the states. So they both support federal government, and really in many ways, the Federalists stole the name, right? And the Anti-Federalists are really angry about that because they're anti, right? They're against something. And they were sort of loudly proclaiming during this year and a half debate that they were the real Federalists, right? The Federalists stole the name. We are the ones who want a federal system. They want the consolidated system of the whole, which is a great threat. So,
Okay, and
it's propaganda.
I didn't mean to interrupt y'all. Y'all go ahead.
No, that was fine. That was part of actually my question too, because it was seeming like I was realizing that there was still a federal system, and you had already said there was still for a republic system, and we still had representation in a similar way, even though there was arguments there, but it was still similar to the point of being recognizable, especially when you compare it against any other type of government in world history. I mean, if you were comparing it, these two would be like siblings compared to people who are not even related as far as the governments they envision versus European governments or any other place in the world government. One thing that was interesting that you said, I don't know if I caught it wrong, but so Federalists were the state among within themselves. You had said that some states had actually, is my internet jumping?
Yeah, a little bit.
I just got a message saying my internet's slow. Is it choppy?
It's okay now, I think.
Okay. So the Federalists were worried about states exercising tyrannical power within the states themselves, and they wanted a constitution in order to give certain powers to the federal government to balance the states. That's a question. I never thought of it like that before.
Right. A lot of people don't know this about James Madison, but he wrote as sort of a memo before the Constitutional Convention. And he talked about sort of the injustices of the state governments under the Articles of Confederation. And really, he's talking about the problems of the Articles. And really, one of the main ones is just how much injustice there was being done in the states. For example, in his native Virginia, there was an established church, and there was severe persecution of religious dissenters like Baptists and so forth. They were being jailed and violently beaten and so forth. They were not enjoying, their rights of conscience. And that was just one example of the injustice being done. And yeah, he goes to the Constitutional Convention, and he actually wants a national veto on state laws because he's terribly worried about what was going on in the states, and also wants a much stronger national government actually than had emerged in the Constitutional Convention. He even wanted both the Congress, both houses of Congress, to have proportional representation. So Madison was really didn't go to the Constitutional Convention with a federal system in mind. He really wanted sort of a much stronger national government because of the problems in the states, and he thought a national government would just be more just, right? And that goes against what we think normally with the American Revolution, right? Because we think that all the founders sort of were opposed to the monarch and King George, and were really afraid of the national government and wanted to preserve liberty. That's all true, but there's a lot of complexities in here that we need to understand to get an accurate picture of what exactly was going on. And Madison is one who really fears the injustice of the states. And someone like Hamilton's really ready just to abolish the states. It's kind of interesting because he felt that the greatest threat to liberty under the Articles was actually the weakness of the central government. He thought if you empowered the national government and sort of almost abolish the states, that would actually be the best way to preserve liberty, because you would have a vigorous and vibrant government executing its powers in a more efficient and better way. And have a stronger national defense and a stronger financial system and all that. So he thought that would be a better means to preserve liberty. So you can see, there's a lot of commonalities, but there's also a pretty wide divide between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists in terms of how they were going to achieve their shared goals, right?
And the purpose of our government was actually listed in our founding documents when it says, the government is there to ensure the happiness of the people, something along those lines. And it's listed in different ways. And it's a unique idea that we take for granted. If our founders were here today, the Federalists or Anti-Federalists, I think all of them would be blown away, of course, by just the power of the modern world and the power of America within it. And they would be so overjoyed with just the common living standard and how high it's risen and so many things. But I think most of us here on this call and most people listening are interested in where the federal system failed. And that's why we're so interested in the Anti-Federalists. And our last guest, we talked about how you really have to have how you're kind of backed into an isolationist corner if you want to carry the Anti-Federalist notion through to the 20th century, and make it through the world wars. And you have to imagine that you'd have to decide that you believe that Europe and Asia would not have tried to cross those oceans to get to us in order to say that the Anti-Federalist system would succeed. Now you can make that case, but I don't really buy it because I think eventually it would expand to our shores and it would have been here. But that being said, the federal system has allowed personal rights to be violated in a way that most people on the call will be able to point to and say maybe it's this or that. Whether it's property rights directly being taken in eminent domain, or whether it's certain rights to life, whether it's many things we would point to and we look to how could this have broken down. And normally functionally we get to some case of the checks and balances breaking down where, okay, well, the courts did this and they clearly ruled in a way that didn't make sense in the way the founders saw it. And then you get from there, it's the conversation splinters off into a whole lot of different opinions as far as what thing to point to. And I guess the question is, in that, would you point to causing the greatest violations of what the founders saw this country to be, and what most of us would say, well, that thing doesn't seem right? Where did the system break down to allow that?
Right. No, I think you raised some really great points, and I'm just continually impressed by the students on this panel for their really thoughtful questions that historians and scholars are wrestling with for decades. I do agree that, the Anti-Federalists have become very popular, especially in the last maybe 10, 20, 30 years. People are sort of rediscovering the Anti-Federalists, and for good reason, right? I think there's a sense among a lot of Americans that the system is sort of out of whack. And if the founders came back today, that it would be a pretty unrecognizable government. I think that that's especially true for the Anti-Federalists. They might even say, see, I told you so. A government run by moneyed elites and a lot of corruption. They might say that we warn you against consolidation. We warn you that the courts or presidency would become too powerful, and that people's rights are being violated. They might say all those things, right? And I think the Federalists, though, as much as they supported a stronger national government, it would be pretty unrecognizable to them as well, right? I don't think that they envisioned the massive regulatory state that has emerged. I don't think they would be terribly supportive of the large welfare state that's grown over the last 70 to 80 years. And I think that a lot of this started in the progressive era, right? Especially with a lot of the regulations that were passed under the Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson administrations. Just the executive branch of the national government became much more powerful, right? And assumed much greater powers. And the government grew and grew and grew and sort of regulated more and more aspects of our lives. And then under, Franklin Roosevelt, in the New Deal, the national government became responsible for people's welfare and the economy and so forth. And so put a much greater hand into our lives. And that's only grown in the last 50 years or the 70 years since World War II, under the Great Society and other things. And despite, attempts by Reagan and others to sort of rein that in and push power back to the states, there have been some quote unquote successes here and there, but not, we're living under, a government with 23, 24, 20, you sort of lose track how many trillions of dollars of debt. We used to spend about $1 trillion 10 or 20 years ago when I was teaching, and now it's what, 3, 4, 5 trillion, and that's not even including all the things that come up like stimulus and infrastructure bills and so forth. So it'd be very unrecognizable to a lot of the founders, really on both sides, particularly the Anti-Federalists. And where have we gone mostly wrong? I'd say just in creating that massive regulatory state that really controls so many aspects of our lives, right? And allows so many interests to promote themselves in the national government. And it's just.
I point to, I will.
Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to, because you said something, I think that's interesting for you that you said the massive regulatory state which is really directly affects our lives in so many ways, personal level. I mean, just in our company and what we do as a theater company, we come up against strange things constantly, daily, which just seem like, well, and we say to each other, wow, I thought we lived in America. And I brought this up to the last guest, and I wonder, do you think this is inevitable with an income tax, that would inevitably create a behemoth of a federal government that would overreach in this way?
Yeah, good question. I'm always a little hesitant to say things are inevitable because there's so much contingency, and we decide, but we can decide, to pursue different paths. I will say this, I think you're onto something. The income tax was a constitutional amendment, the 16th Amendment. Why? Because the founders, the framers, had actually banned the income tax in our Constitution, right? So a constitutional amendment was necessary. So there was concern, right, over taxing people directly, with their incomes. And it did provide the means by which the progressives and then later sort of reform movements and so forth rapidly expanded federal spending, right? The taxes were kind of very low at first, and then during wars they would increase, and then during the New Deal they increased, World War II, and then it just sort of became this tidal wave of sort of maybe not quite inevitability, but just constant sort of progressive increases to the point where we are today, right? And it's, that's obviously very troubling, right? I think the founders, Alexander Hamilton, and really most of them thought that the people would, there would be some taxation for, you need an army and to carry out national objects of government, national powers. But on the other hand, would leave the people to their own devices and would leave people to rule their own economic lives as they and control their property as they saw fit. And so this is very much, I think our modern world is very much out of step with the constitutionalism and the kind of government that all the founders had in mind. None of them would recognize what we've become today.
Great questions, Jordan and Jewel. I want to go to Aubrey, who has got a few questions of her own, as well as Tova sent some questions in since she couldn't be with us today. So Aubrey, let's have a few of those questions.
Yes, thank you. This has been really interesting so far, and I'm excited to ask some questions for Tova. Her first one, she says, what was public opinion about the Federalist and Anti-Federalist positions, and did it change due to the Federalist Papers?
Right, a great question, as I expect from Tova. The popular opinion was that the Americans were arguing this just as vibrantly as the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. we don't have polls from the day, so we can't say exactly, but the vote in several states initially was overwhelmingly Federalist, was overwhelmingly ratified, and there were certain pockets of strength for each side throughout the 13 states. But there were many states, major states, that were sharply divided, and the American people were sort of divided over this new constitution. They were, as they were deliberating over it, as they were debating over it, they were divided. And in many ways, the debate is civil. And in other ways, it can be a little uncivil. I mean, you look at some of the Federalist Papers, and they're saying sort of that, and Federal Farmer says this, the calm and deliberative and rational and cool, sort of cool-headed people, the level-headed people are going to agree with me. And sort of those who are rash and want to kind of rush into a problematic form of new government, they're really not too level-headed. And the Federalists give as well as they got in that regard. And so they're maybe not unlike us, right? We can have a lot of uncivil discussions ourselves, but whereas our politics is really quite poisonous in a lot of ways because of the way we're unable to talk to each other. And I think that's really important. This great deliberative moment, people grappled with these larger questions and largely did so in a civil and deliberative manner, right? And like we said, the American people, I think maybe more importantly than which side they lined up, because they lined up on both sides, is that they took part in this debate, that they were informed. They read these essays. I mean, they were published in newspapers and pamphlets and reprinted across the states. People were reading them, right? Your average artisans, or they were reading them. If there were some illiterate people in the tavern, they would be read aloud, right? The people themselves wanted to take part in this. It was their government, after all. And so that's what's really magical, if you will, about the debate over the ratification.
And
That's
are you
wonderful.
gonna one more, and then we'll go to some
Yeah.
audience questions.
Yes, so another one that Tova asked, she shared the quote. She said, "The federal farmer argues that the federalism of the Constitution is a mirage, for it sets up a structure in which all power will flow to the center." And her question is, has this prediction been proved correct? And has the power in America become more centralized over time?
Right. As usual, Tova goes right to the heart of the matter, pulls out the most important quote in the entire Federal Farmer. I think I need her to be a co-author on my future books. I mean, it's a fantastic quote. It really hits Federal Farmer's critique, right? That it's a sham, right? It's a mirage that you're preserving a federal system in his view. You're consolidating, creating a government that's way too powerful. I actually think we've already addressed that, so I won't necessarily belabor that. But in short, yes. I mean, it's as maybe we said, the Anti-Federalists warned. It became a great consolidated government. Especially in the 20th and into the 21st century, and it's very problematic and troubling.
Okay, well, Jeff R. writes in, could you comment how the General Welfare Clause has caused an explosion of intrusive federal agencies and laws?
Right. Well, it goes back to the debate over Jefferson and Hamilton in the early republic, as they're debating the national bank and the public the report on public credit. There's this very vigorous debate, and what's so wonderful about it is that both they agree that you cannot govern from the General Welfare Clause, right? That the government will promote the general welfare. Yes, it does that, and it's in the preamble, but you can't go. That's it's an elucidation and enumeration of basic principles of government, right? That's not the powers of government in the general welfare. Article 1, Section 8 lists the powers, right? And referring to Jefferson and Hamilton, that's where the debate properly shapes up, right? In the actual enumerated powers and in the necessary and proper clause, right? And so it's this great constitutional debate, but unlike that debate, which is proper and a constitutional one, today it's good for people, so let's do it, right? Or the government's just empowered to do anything in the name of the general welfare, right? Well, that's exactly the kind of thinking and exactly the kind of government that would have left both sides in this debate sort of aghast, right? That you're creating unlimited government, right? And as I said earlier, none of the founders wanted unlimited government because that would ultimately be despotic, it would be tyrannical, and it would be the ultimate threat to people's liberties. It wouldn't be a republic because Madison actually, something we didn't talk about, defines Republican government in Federalist 39. We probably don't have time to read it right now, but I commend it to everyone because he defines very simply what a Republican form of government is. It's not, spoiler alert, it's not a government with unlimited powers that can govern from the General Welfare Clause. And unfortunately, the government has been doing that either, sort of openly or indirectly.
Well, and actually, Tony, that's something that I did highlight when I read Federalist 39, because I thought it was really interesting. And a lot of the school speaking that we do at Constituting America, one of the things that we teach the students is that our form of government in our country is a republic. And I thought this was a great definition. And it says, Madison says in Federalist 39, we define a republic to be a government which derives all its powers directly or indirectly from the great body of the people and is administered by persons holding their offices during pleasure for a limited period or during good behavior. It is essential to such government that it be derived from the great body of the society, not from an inconsiderable proportion or a favored class of it. Otherwise, a handful of tyrannical nobles exercising their oppressions by delegation of their powers might aspire to the rank of republicans and claim for their government the honorable title of republic. And I mean, that is just a really great definition. So thank you for mentioning that. Mary writes in, help me understand why the Constitution gives the House the power of distributing money. She says, to me, it creates a federalist society. Thank you.
Right. Well, the reason why it's in the House actually is pretty simple because the framers did not want it in the Senate, right? They were terribly afraid that if you, gave the authority of the Senate to originate these money bills, that you would create a conspiracy, a cabal, sort of an aristocracy of interest between a really powerful executive and this small group of senators, right? Who again represented the states and sort of maybe a little bit more the upper class. And the House itself, which was the only branch of government in the Constitution that was directly elected by the people, they would be, sort of unable to stop this cabal or this conspiracy of interest of aristocracy. And so the money bills, which I know that we might see it differently because of the changes today, but back then they really wanted to preserve it in the House of Representatives, which was the closest branch of government to the people, as Madison sort of just pointed out.
Great, thank you so much. Another thing I noticed in Federalist 39 is that Madison is trying to make the case. He's listing all the federal nature of the government. And one that he used as an example of the federal system of government that I never really thought of it in this way before is the Electoral College. And because the states have a role in deciding who the president is going to be. And that reminded me that another thing that we like to teach with Constituting America is that we have a horizontal system of checks and balances in our country, but we also have a vertical system, and the states are an important part of that. Could you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you circled back to that. Really, really important. He lists, 3 or 4 ways that the government is federal. And one of those ways, and I think the strongest argument for the Electoral College, by the way, is that the interests of the states and this federal principle is preserved, right? And that, Madison and the other framers argue that the states would have a say in who's president, and that was really important, and there were a number of other devices such as the Senate, right? So in terms of the state legislatures electing the Senate originally, the senators originally, the Electoral College representing the interests of the individual states, you're not just the president sort of the whole nation, because the problem with that is then you can be a demagogue, right? You can just appeal to the masses. You can appeal for the most number of votes. You can promise the people bread and circuses, as they would say in ancient Rome, and promise that you're going to do everything for them and just demagogue them to death. And you'd win elections, right? This way, you have to go to all the states, right, and appeal to the people within all the states. And it preserves the federal principle, but in many ways, it makes you truly a more representative, executive of the people and of all parts of the country, not just, 1 or 2 major cities or regions and so forth. So, he presents really compelling evidence for the Electoral College, for the Senate, even for the amendment process, and the ratification of the Constitution, really these really important points about federalism. And since today we don't really care about federalism in a lot of ways, right? We just accede to this national consolidation. Because of that, we are willing to, get rid of the Electoral College. The 17th Amendment just made, the people of the states elect the senators. And we've sort of been willing to change all these constitutional devices that preserve this really important principle of federalism, that both the Federalists and especially the Anti-Federalists were really, really worried about.
I agree. It's I really believe that our framers, when they put the structure of the government together with the Constitution, it was a very delicate balance. And every time we change something such as the 17th Amendment, or with the movement to get rid of the Electoral College, you're taking it out of balance a little bit and giving even more likelihood that it's going to infringe on freedom, which is, what the Constitution protects. Our last question from the audience, Aaron Cummins asked, do we know what the percentage is who knew what a republic was at the time that they were writing the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist papers? Franklin gives the impression that the lady from Philadelphia knew what a republic was in the famous story, in his quote, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it." Was Franklin's idea of a republic the same as Madison's?
Right, great question. I'll be quick because I know we're almost out of time. All of them knew what a republic was, yes, for sure. But it is true that in this whole debate between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, it exposes that, they had slightly different conceptions about exactly how much power you would give, the people themselves would give to each level of government. So that was all very debatable, and each founder, if there are 100 founders, they're going to have really kind of 100 different views exactly on what the shape of the government should be in its best form. But they all understood and agreed that they wanted to create a republic.
Great. Well, we are almost out of time. Jorn or Jewel, do y'all have any last questions? Aubrey, any last questions y'all want to ask here in the last minute or two?
Just wanted to say, it's, a lot of it, the talk circles around what is going wrong or something along those lines, or maybe certain words like the general welfare. And I wonder, could even misinterpreting pieces like the Commerce Clause or general welfare, couldn't you still say that that the government had to violate some other enshrined right still, even when exercising under an idea like the general welfare, that normally these elements we complain about that are then enforced still violate some other right anyway. So it's not necessarily ambiguity in the Constitution, because even within that ambiguity was reined in by certain principled rights that are then still violated, and are left wondering, why didn't maybe a court or the people rise and say, well, that's still a violation of founding principles.
Right. I mean, I think there are a lot of ambiguous phrases in the Constitution, and it was up to the people themselves and those who governed to govern going forward, and to rule themselves, the people, through their representatives, to sort of give meaning and life to that Constitution and its exact meaning. And I will say this, for about 150 years, right? The branch of government largely did their jobs. Congress passed laws. The presidents vetoed very few laws because they saw Congress doing their job. The Supreme Court overturned. They saw that it was not very necessary to overturn these things. And yet, in the last 100+ years, the exact opposite is true, right? In all these regards. And I think we've lost sense of even the necessity of a constitution ourselves, right? Nowadays, a lot of people out there argue, it's a living constitution. It just kind of means whatever you want it to. Well, if that's the case, it really means nothing then. But I would argue during the first 150 years or so of our republic that by and large, they got things right because all felt a constitutional duty to try to follow it to the best of their ability. They did so imperfectly, okay, but they try to do so to the best of their ability to govern according to this fundamental law of the land. And once you say that, well, that was good for 1787, but it doesn't really apply today, then it's sort of inevitable, if I might use that word, to become lost, and to just do whatever you want. And I think we're pretty much there, sadly. So, but I don't want to end on that negative note.
No, we don't want to end on a bad note, because part of following the Constitution is first knowing the Constitution. And so we're so grateful to you today for coming on our Constitutional Chats podcast and helping shine some light on Federalist 39 and the Anti-Federalist Federal Farmer. And we just thank you so much for your time. And we thank all of our audience for being on and for your great questions. And we want to make sure y'all join us this next Tuesday, July 20th. We're going to be talking about the extended commercial republic. And we're going to be looking at the Anti-Federalist paper and Old Whig 4 and Federalist 10. So go on our website, sign up. We look forward to seeing you. And thank you again, Tony. Thank you, Jewel and Jorn. Thank you, Aubrey. And we'll see y'all all back with our full panel next week. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tony.
Bye.